Welcome to The Explainer. So, if you're the kind of person who just loves unpacking complex history, you are absolutely in for a fascinating ride today. We're essentially opening up a centuries-old detective case file to look at the incredibly chaotic, deeply human origins of early biblical texts. We're going to put on our historian hats and investigate how political disputes and this intense struggle for authority literally rewrote the pages of history.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for the investigation. We'll look at the tools of historical criticism, the birth of a new religion, and then we'll get into the phenomenon of pious fraud, exploring forged signatures, rewritten texts, and finally, the motives where the ends justified the means.
Section 1. Tools of Historical Criticism. Investigating the biblical texts. When we use the historical critical method as our forensic lens, it's not an attack on faith, but rather a way to view these texts as human documents. And right away, we see a really stark contrast. Research shows a clear distinction between the historical Jesus, who was an apocalyptic Jewish preacher from Galilee, and the Christ of faith, which is the figure defined by much later church dogma. As you'll see, the historical evidence strongly suggests Jesus actually intended to reform Judaism, not start a brand new, separate religion. Moving to Section 2, Birth of a New Religion, from Jewish sect to Hellenism. So how exactly did this localized reform movement turn into a massive global faith? Well, it happened through a major pivot into the Hellenistic, or non-Jewish world. And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict of the first century. You had Jewish Christianity, led by James in Jerusalem, insisting that followers still needed to keep the strict Torah law. But then you had Hellenistic Christianity, championed by the Apostle Paul. Paul was out taking the message to the Greco-Roman world, arguing that salvation was available to pagans purely through grace, without needing those strict Jewish laws. It was a massive culture clash. Now take a look at the massive gap in decades on this timeline. We've got the historical Jesus around 30 CE, right? But the definitive split didn't actually happen until the year 70 CE, with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. That cataclysmic event is what caused the final, permanent rupture between Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. And get this, the very first gospel, Mark, doesn't even show up until roughly 75 CE. That is decades after the events it's describing. And that brings us to a really surprising fact. These texts, they were not written by eyewitnesses. They were actually written in Greek, anywhere from 40 to 70 years after Jesus died. Which is wild, considering Jesus and his original followers spoke Aramaic. The stories basically evolved over time as they adapted to Greco-Roman philosophy. This whole process eventually culminated in the Gospel of John, written around 95 CE, which features a highly developed theology of Jesus as the pre-existent Word. Section 3. Phenomenon of pious fraud. Why deeply religious people lied. Now, what's really interesting about this is we're faced with this huge paradox. Why in the world would incredibly faithful scribes intentionally alter their own sacred texts? Well, it all comes down to a concept called pia fraus, or pious fraud. By definition, this is an act of deception, forgery, or falsehood used to promote what the author genuinely believes is a higher divine truth, or maybe just the good of their institution. You know, in the context of early Christianity, the perpetrators didn't see this as malicious lying. To them, they were literally protecting the truth through forged authorship and explicit text insertions. Section 4. Forged New Testament signatures. The practice of pseudepigraphia. So the main tool they used for this was pseudepigraphy. It's essentially a form of ancient identity theft. It's the practice of falsely attributing a brand new text to a well-known, highly authoritative figure from the past. Now, while this practice was somewhat common in antiquity, make no mistake, modern scholars are quick to point out that it was still absolutely considered deceptive if the true authors were ever caught. And the academic consensus points to some massive examples of this right in the middle of the New Testament. Take the Deuteropauline epistles, like Ephesians and Colossians. Those were likely written by later students of Paul, not Paul himself. Then you have the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which are widely considered to be 2nd century fakes meant to address later church issues. And 2nd Peter, scholars overwhelmingly agree it's actually the latest text in the entire New Testament, written way into the 2nd century to defend the delayed second coming of Christ. These writers hijacked famous names, like Paul and Peter, to give their newer ideas immediate, unquestionable authority. Section 5. Rewriting history and texts. The evolution of orthodoxy. But pious fraud didn't just stop at forging entire letters. It actually bled into altering already existing manuscripts while they were being painstakingly copied by hand, which leads us to a pretty fascinating question. When these scribes were faced with a text that didn't match their current theology, or maybe a story that just felt kind of incomplete, how exactly did they improve the Bible? Well, the short answer is they quite literally fixed things. So the crucial point is that scribes would deliberately insert missing doctrines or fix uncomfortable cliffhangers. For example, the Comma Joanneum, which is the clearest mention of the Holy Trinity, is actually completely missing from the original Greek manuscripts. It was inserted into Latin translations centuries later to back up church dogma. Or look at the Testimonium Flavianum. Blatant Christian additions were made to the Jewish historian Josephus's work just to provide some independent historical proof that Jesus was the Messiah. And incredibly, the original Gospel of Mark ends on a massive cliffhanger, with women fleeing the empty tomb in absolute terror. The post-resurrection encounters, those were simply tacked on later by scribes who found that original ending way too uncomfortable.
Section 6. Motives. Ends justify means. The desperate fight for theological survival. Okay, we really have to ask the biggest why behind all of this. Why would deeply devout people forge and alter scripture? Well, because this wasn't some kind of comic book villainy. It was a desperate struggle for survival. Back in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you had multiple factions, the Proto-Orthodox, Gnostics, Marcionites, and they were all fiercely battling to become the dominant orthodoxy. And to win a theological debate back then, pure logic just wasn't enough. You needed a letter from an apostle. So if they didn't have one, they created one. They also used pious fiction to invent things like childhood gospels, mostly just to satisfy the desperate curiosity of believers who wanted to know what Jesus was like as a boy. There's a quote from the sources that I think beautifully summarizes our entire explainer today. Christianity didn't fall from the sky as a finished, perfect system. As we've seen, historical critical analysis reveals a chaotic, centuries-long, deeply human process filled with political disputes and theological evolution. The historical actors involved in this were so fiercely convinced of their own truth that to them, the ultimate end, the salvation of souls and the purity of their doctrine, absolutely justified the means of tweaking history. We have covered a lot of ground in our historical investigation today, so I'm going to leave you with this provocative question. Which part of this chaotic historical process do you want to investigate next? Do you want to dig deeper into that fierce first-century split between the Jewish and Hellenistic factions? Or maybe you want to crack open those mysterious, forged apocryphal texts. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.